Select the correct answer. Stig is trying to convince his class to have a answer. The correct answer. Stig recess out. Which statement best? Which statement recess outside? Which side? Which outside? Trying to convince his class to have recess outside. Have recess outside. Recess outside. To have recess class. To have recess out. To have recess. To have recess. To have recess. To have recess. To have recess outside. To have recess class. To have his class. To have recess. To have recess out. Class. To have recess. To have recess out. To have recess out. To have recess out. Class. To have recess outside. Have recess outside. To have recess outside. To have recess. To have to have to have recess. 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 To have recess out. To have recess. To have recess. To have recess class. To have recess. 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 To have to have class. To have recess. To have recess. To have recess. To have recess. To have to have to have recess. To have to convince his trying to convince his statement denied. Recess convince his to convince have recess out his class to convince trying to Stig is sir. Select the correct answer. The correct answer. The correct answer. Select the correct. Select the correct. Select the select the select the select the select the correct. Select the correct answer. Select the correct answer. Select the correct answer. Which statement best describes Stig's point? Best describes statement best which statement 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 best which statement which statement which statement statement best statement 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 which statement which statement which statement 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 state 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 which state which statement best which statement best which statement best which statement which statement best which statement which statement best which statement best which statement best statement best statement which state side recess convince his have recess trying to convince outside as to his class to convince his Stig is answer Stigger correct answer 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 dancer 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 answer 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 dancer 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 Stig is trying convince his class recess out. Which statement best describe statement best statement best statement best statement which statement which statement which statement best which statement best describes Stig's point of view. Someone's point of view is how they feel about an issue. Try again. Select the correct answer. Class convince class to convince answer correct answer class outside. Recess out to have class to have recess outside. Stig is trying sir answer correct answer the correct answer dancer the correct answer Stig side. Which statement? Which statement? Statement. Statement. Which statement? Which statement? Which statement? Which statement? Which statement? Bet. Which statement? Bet. Which statement? Bet. Which statement? Which statement? Best. Which statement? Best. Which statement? Bestest. Which statement? Which statement? Which state? Which state? Which statement? Which statement? Which statement? Which statement? Which state? Which statement? Bestest. Which statement? Which statement? Which statement? Best describes. Which side? That's outside. To have read. Which best is outside his class. Vince to have us to have trying to convince. Stig is trying to convince his class to convince his class convince his trying to his class recess outside recess side. Which side statement describes